So, we were talking about writer's block, and let's talk about another thing or another type of writer's block. Sometimes it's not so much that we don't understand the events that happen, it's that we don't understand our characters. So, as we carry on with our second part of this writer's block series, we are going to delve into story arcs. Again, today on Writing in the Tiny House. Hello, and welcome to today's episode. I am your host, Devin Davis, and I am the guy who lives in a tiny house in northern Utah who writes things and then likes to share what the writing process looks like. The whole point is to give you the tools and the inspiration and the knowledge necessary for you to start and finish a short story in 3 months, or to start and finish a novel in 18 months, and above all, to give you the wisdom and the foresight to understand that sometimes that timeline will need to be adjusted. I would dare say almost every time. Sometimes not understanding the time commitment that something like this has can deter us from even getting started. And so understanding that it is something that can clip along at a fast pace if we want it to, and if we are prepared to make that happen, can be valuable for a lot of us to even get started. So last week, we talked about our cold, hard outline. We talked about the scenes, and we talked about reorganizing scenes, or revisiting and revising our outlines as a way to combat writer's block, especially if we are writing a plot-heavy book. If we are writing something super plot-driven, as fantasy and science fiction tend to be, sometimes our outlines need to be a bit more dynamic, and sometimes we need to give ourselves permission to take a day off of our word count goals in order to revise the map of what our story is going to be and where things are headed. So today, and this is a situation that I ran into pretty recently, it is not so much that we don't understand the structure of the story itself. It's not so much that we don't understand the roadmap. It's that as we get into the story and as we start composing and drafting and these characters come more to life, sometimes we don't understand our characters very well. And so we get to a point where we simply don't know where else to go just because what is on our outline no longer matches our characters. I mentioned last week that I am in a lot of different Facebook groups, all geared toward creative writing, and the idea of writer's block comes up a lot. And I like to pay attention and see what people suggest and see what people are doing as a way to combat writer's block. And one thing that some people suggested recently that I really liked was the idea of sitting down and feeling out your characters. So the lady in the Facebook group suggested interviewing your characters. That can be whatever you want it to be. If you want to actually sit down and talk to a person or whatever, or if you want to say things in your character's stead, or perhaps write out a script, whatever things look like. The point is to sit down and feel out your characters. With a work in progress, it can be very valuable to actually keep a running outline of where you have been so that you can remember where things went and where things are going and where some of the character things, where some of the huge developmental character things happened and how they happened and what they were for. It can be really valuable to tease all of that apart into the separate character arcs so that you can see that if your main character is a woman named Hoshiko, which is the case in one of my books, and you see that Hoshiko makes it to the main island and does the things, and gets in touch with an art collector and whatever else. You can see where the big important events happened, and you can see why. And you can ask yourself, does all of that make sense? And does all of that support where the character needs to be now and where the character needs to be here in half a second when I keep writing? And oftentimes the answer is not quite yes. So it's important to do this with all of your characters that you are following through your story, all of the main characters. Sit down and see where they're going, see where they have come from, the big stepping stones that they stepped on or stepped over in order to get where they are now. And now, as a character who is well developed and more into this story because the story is more real to you at this point, and you can further flesh out and further develop things in a different way from a better informed standpoint than you did before you started. Just because, I mean, if we're getting writer's block, odds are we're a chunk into the story. And we understand the story better than we did before we started. And so it is better to start making decisions like that at this point. Sometimes the inspiration or the solution to the writer's block can be that a character needs a specific thing or a certain event that isn't in your outline right now needs to happen in order to get your character into a more believable place. Or some of the things that you wrote already may not have built up your character or your scene to a place where it needs to be. I experienced that pretty recently, actually. I was getting to the end of a scene. I felt pretty good about the way that I had written it up to that point. And yet here I was standing. So I have a standing desk in the tiny house. Right now, I don't have an office chair. I've been meaning to buy an office chair for like 7 months, and I still haven't done it. But I was standing here dumbfounded, mouth agape, sort of, staring at my computer because I could not figure out what was going on next, what needed to happen next. And what I came to realize was the source of the writer's block wasn't so much what was coming next. The source of the writer's block came from the previous couple pages that I had written didn't build up the characters and the scene to a place where it needed to be. It had been a slightly different direction. And so I needed to go through what I had already written and revise stuff and delete stuff and add some stuff in order to correct the course that the story had already been going. And once I did that, the writer's block was gone. I was able to get back into the flow of writing again. And I was able to touch base with the characters and see where they needed to be and plug in the necessary things in order to have a good story. That is just a simple but a very good thing. It ties back into outlining, but you can see that it's bigger than just outlining. I mean, writer's block is bigger than just simply not being able to write. There are a lot of facets that go into writer's block, and I wanted to touch on some of these things that go into that. So last week we talked about just structure of the story. This week, sometimes it's the character arc. Sometimes the characters need a thing, and sometimes what you have written does not support where they need to go. And so some revamping or some adding or some deleting or whatever is the right call to make that change and to get the flow back into the story. And next week, as we conclude this series on writer's block, we are going to talk about your inner environment. Sometimes it's not actually about writing. Sometimes it's about you. So be sure to tune in next week as we wrap up this little mini-series on writer's block on writing in the tiny house. Thank you so much, guys. Bye. And that is it for today. Just a reminder that Brigitte, installment 1 of Tales from Vlador, is available on Amazon as an ebook and on Audible and Apple Books as an audiobook. And I provide advance reader copies of these short stories as I release them to my patrons. So become a patron today by visiting patreon.com/writinginthetinyhouse to support both my writing and this podcast. And lastly, be sure to follow me on social media. My Instagram is @authordevin and my Twitter handle is @authordevind. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today, and have fun writing. We will see you next time. Run by copy editor Chrissy Barton, Little Syllables Editing is a reliable resource for anyone looking to improve their manuscript. Chrissy does line edits, copy edits, and the final proofread for experienced writers and newbies alike. Go to littlesyllables.com and reach out to Chrissy today. A link is in the show notes.